We do know that the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments today over President Donald Trump's bid to follow through with an executive order that would restrict birthright citizenship here in the United States. We do know this is the first broad challenge to the constitutional right in decades. I do want to bring into the conversation now Susham Modi with the Modi Law Firm as well. He's also a former professor of law. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now.
Thanks for having me, Christina.
All right. Thanks again for joining us, because this is a topic that has gotten the entire nation's attention at this point. I first want to start with you just explaining for folks who aren't maybe clued into what the 14th Amendment is and what we can expect for that and how it's served us over the last few years here in our country.
Sure. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is a right where any individual who's born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. But the key component here is it says subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, historically, it's been very limited only under like extreme circumstances that they're not a U.S. citizen. So, for example, diplomats, children of diplomats that are born here are not U.S. citizens. Or before the 1924 Act was passed, Indian Americans were not U.S. citizens, or during really hostile occupations of the U.S. That may not count. But almost in every other circumstance, when someone's born here, the seminal doctrine is called jus soli, that when you're born here on U.S. soil, that you are a U.S. citizen.
And that's what so many families have relied on for the last years, over 100 years since this has been in place. I do, though, want to move on to something else. When we're talking about how it's been used here in our country in the past, its history dates out to the 1800s. Has it ever been challenged before to this highest level of the Supreme Court? Also showing some images of those sketches that we had a bit earlier today.
Yes, it has been challenged before, but very rarely. In fact, the first challenge is very similar to the case we have here of the executive order. It was a case in 1898. So to give it some context, that's only about 30 years after the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was enacted. And in that case, back in those old days, what we had was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So a bad part of U.S. history where we were excluding Chinese immigrants from the U.S. And that case dealt with immigrant parents, Chinese immigrants, who had a child that was born here in the United States. And that had actually gone up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had ruled that that child, it's called the ARC case, was a U.S. citizen. So it's very similar to what we have here. And the reason it's so important, again, is contextually what the Supreme Court is looking at is what were the framers' intent of the 14th Amendment. And since it was just 30 years after it was enacted in a precedent setting case, I think that's why you see every court that's ruled on this before has found that the executive order is unconstitutional, even with one judge saying it's blatantly unconstitutional.
And we're looking at some of these images now of some folks who are protesting outside of the Supreme Court today. Again, focusing on what's right there in front of us, the 14th Amendment saying that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Let's talk about some of the current positions of those justices on the court. With it leaning conservative that we know at this time, could this ultimately affect the final decision? When will we know how they will rule on this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Christina. I mean, to take a step back, I think the answer is going to be no. I mean, we have to remember these justices are amazing backgrounds. So they've been to the best schools, they've practiced for a long time, they've been judges for a long time. So even though they may be conservative, when a law is clear, as we may have it here, I think that they're going to rule that it's unconstitutional. In fact, if we take a more recent example of these justices, there was the Alien Enemies Act. That was the rule where President Trump was trying to remove individuals to El Salvador, and that was put on hold by the Supreme Court. And that was a majority decision, a 7-2 decision on habeas. So that just shows an example of, even though the court may be conservative, now with 3 of those justices, by the way, appointed by the first Trump administration, they still, all three of those still ruled according to the law. And so I think that's what we're going to have here as well, in it being found unconstitutional, as every other court has ruled on it.
And if that's to be the case, let's talk about again what would ultimately happen if the Supreme Court does choose to overrule those lower courts. What would that ultimately mean for birthright citizenship? Would that be the end of that path there in the United States, ending there with the Supreme Court?
Yeah, and just to clarify, Christina, I think they're going to rule that the executive order was unconstitutional, meaning that the birthright citizenship, they are born here and they are U.S. citizens. And so I don't think that's likely to happen. But under that scenario that you just gave, if it did happen, you're going to see a whole lot of turmoil, because there's a lot of questions that go unanswered here. So one question, for example, is what happens to those individuals that were born here? They don't have another country to go to. They're not a citizen of any other country. So could they be stateless, for example, if they're born here after the Supreme Court's decision? That's just one of other issues as well, which is state and federal rules. So let's say someone's born here and the state of California deems them a resident, but now the federal government doesn't. So it could create all kinds of other problems that haven't been addressed. But again, I don't think that's likely. I think, like every other court has ruled, I think President Trump's executive action is very likely, or in some cases, by judges, blatantly unconstitutional.
All right, and as we're kind of looking again at some of these sketches, I appreciate you for just breaking down the very latest. As you can see, we're also getting in some of these responses. I just want to read this one out. This is from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She says, as far as I can see it, this order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents. It does seem like they're going to be leaning a lot on the precedents that happened before now to make their decisions. Is that right?
That's correct. And that's how our jurisprudence is structured. It's by case law and looking at prior precedents. And that's why, as I mentioned, that first case that ruled on a similar issue in 1898, the Ark case, is going to be so important, because that was the closest case to what were the founders of the Constitution thinking with that amendment of the 14th Amendment. It was only 30 years after. And then there's 3 other precedent cases on point as well. So I don't think the Supreme Court is going to overturn, over 120 years of U.S. precedent.
And lastly, what about other constitutional amendments? We do know that President Trump has issued several executive orders since he's been in office for this second time around. Does this leave any of those up to interpretation as well? Could we see a similar legal process take place when we're thinking about that?
Yeah, another great question, Christina. I think each question deals with its own constitutional provision. So one of the big ones we're seeing with the Alien Enemies Act I had referred to before is really like the right, even for immigrants, to have due process, which is under the 5th Amendment, a different part of the U.S. Constitution. And that case law is going to be analyzed under that different paradigm. So I don't think it's going to be a structure where this, sets a major impact. I think justices know that they should be looking at that exact provision that they're analyzing and the precedent that it sets forth under each individual circumstance.
All right, we certainly appreciate you for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Susham Modi as well. He's a former law professor, also a legal analyst, helping us to break down this case that has now been brought before the Supreme Court. We appreciate you for joining us here on Live Now.
My honor. Have a good day.